Screen this thing.
Oh, hold on. We're now live. So hold on a second and I'll help you out. Hi, this is Andy Revkin, the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Welcome to the latest edition of Sustain What, which is a several times a week discussion of pathways to sanity and progress on a fast forward planet still wrapped in a pandemic that's disrupted our great acceleration. We were in 50 years into Zoom mode as a species, which scientists in 2015 identified this as what they called the Great Acceleration. I was on the Anthropocene working group because of something I wrote back in the early 90s about the human imprint on the planet. And the Anthropocene is the idea that we're so potent now that we're changing Earth's geological history going forward. It's a remarkable moment in our species' history in both of those senses. The surge we've had, the pause we've been that's been enforced on us, and where do we go from here? And it's a pleasure today to have Lily Cole, who is best known perhaps as a model, but has done so many other things and has written such a powerfully passionate but grounded new book that, thinking of her as a public figure just in the context of fashion is way too limiting. And Pat Brown, who's the CEO of Impossible Foods, which has shown it's possible to create foods that are not meat as we knew it, but that substitute in our flavor and experience for that thing without slaughtering animals and using a lot of land and energy and water and all the other things that go into mass livestock production. But you'll hear too, Pat has an extraordinary backstory as well. And so we'll start with those stories a little bit and then get into the details of the book and your current work and where do we go from here. And I'd like to ask you both something that you both have this career path that started in one direction and then moved pretty powerfully into multiple different directions. And I want to get a sense from you of how that happened. Lily, you had an art history background, obviously an early career in fashion, but so the but is what made you divert into this much broader landscape of innovation with online tools for sharing, with writing a book that is so engaged on both the technology and the ethics of sustainability. How did that jog happen?
I mean, I ask myself it most days because I'm still surprised that I went on that trajectory. And in many ways, to be honest, right now I'm trying to get back to my kind of art trajectory because I think that's where my heart is in many ways. But I think from a young age, I've always been interested in kind of social political issues and trying to understand the world and I guess caring is, I don't say in a self-congratulatory way, but just in a kind of honest way that I guess cared a lot. And what happened, I think, is by going into fashion, that desire, like that interest in caring got channeled into business because I started looking at supply chains and the fashion houses I was working with, and really, really understanding the impact that business has and supply chains have. And that put me on a kind of unusual trajectory from my own perspective in terms of going into business. And then through doing that, I suddenly saw technology as this like massive lever of power, digital technology in particular, and ended up working in the kind of tech space. So I say that to say that all the business technology stuff I've done has happened purely because I guess care about social environmental issues. And it's been a surprise to me that I've worked in those spaces, but I've worked in those spaces because they feel like the most powerful ways to engage in those topics.
And your background, I was reading up, you came from Wales, is that right? And from a coal mining.
Oh, I've lost you, Andy.
Oh.
And I've lost Pat.
Can you hear me okay? Oh, that's weird. Pat, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you and I can see Lily. So
Lily, you might have to.
I lost you for a second. Maybe let me switch my internet channels in case I'm having a problem.
Okay.
And why didn't you ask Pat while I do that?
Yeah, if you want, you can pop back in and come back out or whatever. So
give
Pat,
me 1 minute.
Yep. Hold on 1 second. I'll just do one thing here. So Pat, you started out wanting to be a pediatrician a long, long time ago. It looks like you studied pediatrics, right?
Yeah, I studied pediatrics. I actually worked as a pediatrician for 3 years, which was something I loved. And I love taking care of patients and so forth, and just sort of the immediacy of having an impact. But I realized that actually I could have a bigger impact. I already had a PhD when I was doing that I could have a bigger impact by doing research, because you're taking care of patients in some cases that you really can't help because we don't know how to fix this. And so I felt that trying to get the answers to those questions would mean more. So yeah.
So that also sounds like the scale thing. In other words, dealing with one child versus a cluster of patients versus population, are actually improving lives on a broader scale. That seems to be part of it too.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that it's very different. Like when you're doing something where you're just it's immediate and you're seeing the impact in real time, which is true when you're taking care of patients and so forth. There's something viscerally rewarding about that it just feels meaningful in real time. And when you're doing things where the impact is more distant, like when you're doing basic scientific research, that by understanding how to solve this problem, you're going to have a big impact, but it's a completely different kind of way of operating. So
right.
Anyway.
And then biochemistry, which is really sort of like how things work on the very tiny scale. You had innovations early on in assessing DNA activity in cells and the like, and even there, you were a luminary in that science, sufficient to get you into the national academies and the like. But you still had this sort of push forward toward application in the real world. You took some time off, from what I could see, to assess what to do with the rest of your life, which is kind of a gift. And I'm going to ask Lily about that too. Lily, I have a sense you're impatient and patient at the same time. In other words, you're grappling with a very big question here, as opposed to racing in with some sign saying here's the solution. But I was saying to Pat that he seems to have this ability to stop and assess even in the midst of a busy career and say, am I on the right track? And I guess the answer for Pat was food. So Lily, back to you. I assume we have a good connection there. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I think so. I hope so.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
No worries. It's all fine. We're in this digital world where, unfortunately, it's still, you can find even in the United States, there are big communities, tens of millions of people who don't have access to the gift of internet connectivity. And we've talked about that lately. And on the world, there really is a digital divide still. But here we are, connecting miraculously from 3 different places. So Lily, I was asking you about you. I think your grandfather was a coal miner.
Mm-hmm.
We had a movie here called Coal Miner's Daughter. So you're a coal miner's granddaughter. So you've had your own trajectory from a world essentially in a community where you lived that built around fossil norms, and you propelled yourself forward out of that. It's pretty an interesting track.
Well, to be clear, my mum grew up in that community in South Wales, very much in the kind of heart and thick of the coal mining community, whereas I was brought up in London. So I live in the kind of the history and the stories and the kind of ancestral information, which I find particularly interesting, but it wasn't part of my growing up reality. Yeah,
but part of your family background.
Yeah. Actually, interestingly, farming too. Farming and coal mining were the kind of the only options, I think, for most people in Wales back in the day. And my dad's a fisherman, so I have a lot of kind of farming, fishing, stories in the past. Industries that need to be disrupted, right? So that's what's interesting. So and that's what I try and look at in the book, is also the human dimension of disrupting these industries. If we do need to change them, which we arguably do for environmental reasons, then how can we do that in a way that's sympathetic to the communities that depend on them?
Right. Yeah, that's this just transition question. It has to be, there's disruption all around us. And climate impacts are one thing, but there are also impacts through the lack of energy in many communities around the world where women are cooking on firewood still. and also communities that relied, as you just said, economically on the old system. You can't just magically wave a wand and say, okay, you're all going to be solar panel installers now. It's a tough road ahead. So before we get into some specifics too, I want to ask you both about one thing that also binds you, which is an interest in the internet and its miraculous potential to connect us all, to get information moving where it's needed freely. A minute ago, before we started, I was talking with Pat about being a co-founder of Public Library of Science, a set of journals for scientific information, PLOS, as it's called, that was trying to get around past that, the blockades. If you're in a developing country, you can't pay for the ridiculous subscription for journals that can give you the scientific information you might need to progress. And you, Lily, you were in 2013 or so, you had developed Impossible with others, including Jimmy Wales, who's done the impossible thing of creating a mass information system that is freely accessible and self-curating, and it sits there amid all the noise we have on the internet in a very powerful way as a sort of one place you can go that's reasonably secure. So maybe if each of you could talk about your own, what drove you to realize that this is a very special domain. Maybe Lily first.
Yeah, sure. So mine was kind of by accident because I'm not very technically literate, as my Wi-Fi issues just gave away. And when I was in my last year of university, I was having a conversation with a friend about the economic crisis. It was in 2010, so we're talking about what happened in the last few years, and reflecting on the fact that, you know, it's strange if you zoom out kind of on the picture that humanity is so dependent on money as a tool to kind of organize ourselves that we forget that we've actually designed it, that it's a made up tool. So when you have an economic crisis, a lot of communities and societies, you know, are in a lot of trouble and fall apart. Whereas actually, if you think about it, the amount of resources we have, the amount of time we have, the amount of skills we have, like the really meaningful things are still in kind of equal measure and abundant. And we were wondering if technology and the internet could help facilitate new ways of trading. And I stumbled upon this idea. I started researching it online, researching it academically. I could see that there was something kind of growing in the online space. Platforms like Airbnb weren't known at the time, but they did exist, weren't well known. And what's called now the kind of sharing economy, collaborative consumption area is what I kind of fell into, and I set up the company Impossible as a way to try and facilitate trade. Did you lose me? Sorry.
You're back.
Okay, good. Sorry. And yeah, so that put me on a journey of seeing the potential of the internet to, I guess, create new economic, political structures different to what we've had in the past. And I was kind of amazed by the potential of technology and digital technology to do that. I met Tim Berners-Lee, I met Jimmy Wales, I met kind of a lot of actors who I think have represented very well the potential of digital, like how it can be open source, how it can be grassroots, how it can enable new ways of communicating and organizing. And I was quite, I guess, tech utopian in those days. And today I still hold on to that utopian spirit in terms of the potential I think digital has, but I've maybe much more aware and mindful of the more negative ways that it's being used and it's played out. And so I'm a bit more kind of, I guess, less utopian and more agnostic to its impacts.
And Pat, describe what drove you and your colleagues to launch PLOS at that time.
Well, it's a bit of a long story, but the short version is that I was a scientist. At the time I had developed a new way with my students and postdocs in my lab to be able to look at the activity of a whole genome at once, which was a new thing. You could see what every gene was doing, basically. We were collecting a lot of data, looking at how the genome was reacting to all sorts of conditions, different what's the global gene expression pattern in this cell versus that cell, in this physiological state versus that, in this disease state versus that. We had thousands of observations of tens of thousands of genes under a whole range of conditions, and it was a huge source of connections about how genes relate to each other, how genes relate to phenotypes, and connections between different physiological states and so forth. And part of trying to get the full benefit of that is you want to take all the things that we know about any of those genes and all the things we know about those cell types, physiologies, et cetera, and the system of links between them, and use that as a way of synergizing all that. The problem was that I ran into was, well, all that stuff is published in scientific articles, and I realized when I tried to, and I wanted to create a sort of text mining system for making the links, and I realized that, holy crap, I'm not allowed to do that. Like, scientists have gone to the trouble of doing all this research and publishing it to advance science, to enable other scientists to build on their work and so forth. And the friggin' publishers, whose ostensible job is to disseminate this information for the greater good, are restricting the dissemination of it and the use of it. I was just absolutely infuriated, and I felt like, okay, I'm gonna fix this. And one of the things I did, it happened that a very good friend of mine, who I'm sure you know, Harold Varmus, who was my former postdoc advisor, was then the director of the NIH. And I sort of conspired with him to create a site that NIH maintained called PubMed Central, which would be a public repository of research articles and so forth. Anyway, it required cooperation from the publishers, and they didn't cooperate. And so at some point, I just felt like, okay, well, that's not working. Rather than trying to, I spent a lot of time trying to persuade them to participate. Then I decided, okay, well, too bad then. I'm going to compete with you and do it and effectively create an open access publisher that makes all the research available to the world for free, and have a business model for that. So that was Public Library of Science. And it wasn't just about solving my problem of, as a scientist, being able to have access to all this information. It's that it's unconscionable that, if you are whatever, the mother of a kid who has some, bad disease, and you want his doctor, or you want to really know what's the best possible way of dealing with this. If you go to the most authoritative source, which is this medical literature, your taxes paid for that research.
Exactly.
And you can't access it. I just feel like that is a crime against humanity. So and it's still not a fully solved problem, but the fact is that it's entirely possible in a sustainable way, as PLOS has shown, to have a publication system that makes the information immediately freely available to the public. But we still have some work to do.
And Lily with impossible.com. Oh, yeah, sure.
I was going to say, if you don't know him already, I should connect you to Jimmy Wales. I feel like that's a good Wikipedia problem to solve.
It is. He took a different and very, very clever approach to the problem. The problem is that there are a lot of things that are cited in Wikipedia that are in the scientific literature, and you click on those links, and basically you're asked to pay $50 if you actually want to read that article. So but I love.
No, that's what I mean. You need a new Wikipedia for medical information. Yeah. But anyway,
free the information is essentially the key mantra, especially on a world with such imbalance. Again, developing country. If you're a young pathologist in Rwanda, or a neurologist, or in agriculture, and you want to kind of look in the literature to see which which technological or scientific avenue to pursue. You can't do it.
It's completely unconscionable, and it's absolutely true in poor countries. All that scientific, you're a scientist, all that scientific literature and information might as well not exist, except for the small fraction that's open access. And the irony is that with the internet, the incremental cost of another reader of a paper getting the information to them is essentially zero. It just makes absolutely no economic sense.
Yeah. So I thought we'd dive into the book a little bit. I'm going to show, I have a PDF, thankfully. I'll show a couple of the chapter themes just as a way to get at this. And one of the ones that certainly convenes you, the two of you, connects you, is food, obviously. But most of what you've written in the book, Lily, has this really great journalistic quality of getting beyond the buzzword or the hashtag or what we think we know about something, and being more nuanced. Several of the chapters set things up as, is technology going to ruin us or not? And I think in most cases, correct me if I'm wrong, you sort of say it depends, right? It's complex. It's not technology that's the enemy. It's not meat per se that might be the enemy. It's the how we produce it or what's behind the fashion. Is that a fair statement? Is there any avenue you pursued and dug in on where the answer was a specific yes or no, like that's wrong, we need to stop it, or is it more nuanced?
I think everything is extremely nuanced, and I make a point in the book of trying to nuance and in each area look at also at diverse perspectives, because I found that there are, in every topic, there is a lot of experts, and I don't say that in a belittling way, like truly experts in their field who are kind of chasing the same end goal of more sustainability, for example, but have different approaches or different ideas of how to get there. And because these debates are super complex, I was very interested in listening to the different arguments and trying to weigh them up and present them to the reader so that readers can make their own decisions and find their own way. That being said, there are, of course, my own biases and my own opinions do inevitably feed into it somewhat. And there are areas I think that we can be quite clear about, like, fossil fuels are a problem. It's very clear. The science around them is very, very clear. How do we move away from them? And then there are different arguments about how you replace them, what the transition should look like, and what are the best alternatives. But I think the idea that we have to move away from fossil fuels ASAP is very clear. I think also the idea that we have to move away from eating as much meat as we are right now and other animal products is also very, very clear. Then you can enter a debate about whether we should be eating any meat at all. And I went into that debate and I try and look at the different kind of arguments and, what are the alternatives we replace it with. I think that can get more nuanced, but the idea that we have to change our eating habits as a kind of, global collective, I think is very, very clear.
Was it meat that connected you first to Pat Brown? Is that how he ended up in the book, or had you intersected in some other way before?
No, it's our attachment to the impossible that we both.
Yeah, it was
Founded
weird, even though we have a lot of
Impossible.
common interests. It was that I named my company Impossible, and then realized at some point that Lily had named her. I guess it's not a company, but Endeavor Impossible, and. Right. So we came together over that, but it turned out we actually had a lot of interests in common.
Well, that says, I think that in some way, reflects the common.
We actually met, I remember, but what I also would say is there are actually a number of companies called Impossible out there if you Google, Impossible. And I guess also what struck me was that when I first spoke to Pat and his team, it was about trademarks. It's super boring, like we both have the same company name.
Lily, we lost you.
Well, Pat, could you take up the slack there? So obviously it was something about the names and trademarks, but
yeah, so
you must have continued on from there.
Yeah, so I mean that's what.
How do we, do this in a?
She'll probably come back on. Yeah, I think.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Sorry, Lily, you got cut off.
Sorry, I'm away with my family, so I think my internet's proving not very good.
Someone else streaming.
No,
that never happens in my household.
I think just remote internet. No, I'm not blaming my family. What I was just trying to say is that Impossible Foods and Pat were very nice and cool, and it was like a very amicable agreement around how to negotiate both wanting the word impossible in our lives. And I think the fact that we did both choose the word impossible does probably, I guess, belie the fact that we have similar instincts in a way, like ambitious goals.
So, Pat, I'd like to fit in a little bit of your exploration of post-meat, a world with meat, but maybe with a new definition of what meat is. Meat is the experience of eating a certain thing, whatever it's made of. Is that a fair way to describe your, how Impossible Foods products fit into the landscape?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, basically, I had very little interest in food 10 years ago. It never would have occurred to me to be doing what I'm doing now. I had such a great job at Stanford, and but what I realized, and is really true, and I'm more than happy to defend, is that the use of animals as a technology for transforming plants into meat and fish and dairy foods is by far the most destructive technology in human history. Okay, nothing even comes close. And I could go down an endless list of reasons why it needs to be replaced. Two, which I think you will easily recognize, is one, climate change. Not only is it a major contributor to climate change, more than all power transportation put together, but it also is the biggest sort of opportunity cost for climate change mitigation. That there is an opportunity, which I can go into the technical details of, but it's true, that if you could snap your fingers and make that industry vaporize, which I would do in a heartbeat, leaving the people, of course, but the industry gone. The atmospheric greenhouse gases, the net climate forcing, would immediately start to decrease, okay? And you would have net negative greenhouse gas, emissions, you could say, for a couple of decades. Like if we could turn back, so, here we are in this situation where, and it's crazy that people still think this, that, these international organizations are going to solve the problem for us, countries are going to come together and make commitments, blah, 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 blah. So you have the Paris Accord, which basically signs on to a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global average temperatures. Are you kidding me? That is completely unacceptable. We should never accept that. We have to turn back the clock on climate change and not sign on to this ridiculous trajectory. And secondly, anyway, then the people who signed on to that agreement aren't even keeping their commitment. So this is not going to be solved by politicians. This has to be solved by individual initiative and basically science. So that's one thing, is climate change. There's actually a way that getting rid of livestock by itself will trigger a net decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, which I'm happy to explain. The other thing is that this ridiculous technology is almost solely responsible for a catastrophic collapse in global biodiversity. There was just 2 or 3 weeks ago, the World Wildlife Fund published something they publish periodically called the Living Planet Report, which is basically a report on the state of biodiversity in the world, particularly wildlife biodiversity. And what they report is that the total number of living wild mammals, reptiles, birds, amphibians, and fish, pretty much across the board, from this very systematic kind of census of thousands of species that they've been doing for 50 years, the total number of living wild animals on Earth is less than a third what it was 50 years ago.
Right.
And it's almost entirely due to our use of animals for food, overfishing in the oceans, and basically habitat destruction and degradation due to animal agriculture for terrestrial species. And that's because essentially the entire land footprint of humanity is animal agriculture. It occupies 45% of the surface of the earth is exploited for animal agriculture, as opposed to less than 1% for every city, factory, every human-built, structure fits on less than 1% of the land. People think it's cities and suburbs that are chewing away at nature. It's completely wrong. It's animal agriculture. So anyway, it has to be taken down. And so that's why basically I said, okay, even though I love this job at Stanford, I got to quit it and make this happen.
And Lily, your approach of looking at the full life cycle impacts of a fashion or a product or travel, flight, you do have a whole section on flying. When you take that and look at impossible foods, we all still have to examine the full life cycle energy and otherwise of making that impossible food at scale. So I want to get a sense of how that works out. It takes a lot of energy to produce any kind of mass-produced product. I assume if you calculate the full life cycle of what you were just describing and compare it to what it would take to create not just an impossible burger, but to supplant that part of the meat landscape widely, as I think you're working on steak and some of the other things. What does that add up to too? You still have to keep growing.
That's a great question. And of course, we do ourselves all the time, and then we have independently audited life cycle analysis of our process and so forth. So on the basis of that, and you can look up, we have all the data on our website, the process that we use, for example, to produce the one mass market product we currently have on the market, but it'll be the same for steak, basically, is that it has about 9-fold less net greenhouse gas emissions than producing the same thing from a cow. It uses about 8-fold less water. Water pollution footprint is 12 times less. The land footprint is 25-fold less, okay? So, and when I talk about the net greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't count the opportunity cost of that huge land footprint, which is actually, the flip side is, that is the opportunity to turn back the clock on climate change. So no, there's no comparison. And people often think, oh, look at all the energy that goes into transporting food and producing it and so forth. It's a rounding error compared to the greenhouse gas emissions of just the primary production process. That's very well documented. I mean, people have looked a lot at the kind of greenhouse gas, where the greenhouse gas emissions come from in the food production system. And everybody talks about, oh, it's all, it's flying kiwis from New Zealand or something like that. That's a tiny, tiny fraction of it. It's virtually entirely the inherent insane greenhouse gas footprint of animal agriculture that's responsible for it.
And there's also that ethical footprint too, the slaughter, anyone who's been in a mass meat facility.
Well, and there's
I would
a public
also
health
add,
impact. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I was going to add. That, and I mean, I would, if anybody's interested in this topic further, and we have the second episode focuses specifically on the arguments for and against different versions of meat. So it goes into quite a lot of detail, because I'm quite interested. I completely agree with Pat. I completely agree that we need to massively change the animal agriculture system, particularly, I think, from a personal perspective, the factory farming system and kind of intensive animal agriculture. But I do hold a lot of sympathy space for the arguments of some environmentalists who argue that regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, is a really important part of the solution, rather than thinking only about kind of mass scale production.
Well, I think that's a complete myth, Lily.
And is the public health. Feel free to tell me why. I mean, a lot of the research I looked at suggests that organic agriculture is a really big part of a solution in terms of carbon capture and soil health. So we do have to question how we grow non-meat products, i.e. grains and vegetables. Oh yeah, you're bringing it up. Very fast work.
Yeah, it's a long conversation, but I can distill it down to, first of all, if you talk to people who are ecologists about the ostensible literature that says that regenerative farming is a meaningful way of carbon capture, I would say you would find a large majority of them that think that the evidence that is cited is complete nonsense. Okay, it's provocative thing to say. It's just garbage as science. But I'll give you like a more intuitive way of understanding it. Okay, suppose that you burn down, big chunks of the Amazon so that we can put cattle on them. Okay, do you seriously believe that in the best possible practice of regenerative farming, you're going to come anywhere close to recapturing the carbon that you've blown into the atmosphere by tearing up all that biomass, somehow by having cows wandering around on the ground? Anyway, the evidence that does any meaningful thing for carbon capture is essentially negligible, but it gets repeated all the time. But even if that were true, like I say, what we're talking about is we've taken that 45% of the Earth's land surface, taking the native biomass from that land, turn it into CO2, replace it with these bleak landscapes that are covered by cows. The total number of cows on Earth there's 1.5 billion cows on Earth. They outweigh every remaining wild vertebrate by more than a factor of 10. Okay, it's complete idiocy. And there's no conceivable way in which that is sustainable. And actually, extensive animal farming is more environmentally destructive. I hate factory farming. I would blow up every factory farm in the world if I could. But it's more. It has less of an environmental footprint than extensive animal farming.
Well, Lily, I'd love to hear from you.
I would say I'm not trying to. Well, I guess my response to that would be, and I'm not saying I'm right, but in terms of digesting the different perspectives, is whilst I completely agree we need much, 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 much less than we have right now, and I agree that comparing like wild land to regenerative agriculture, wild is going to win, i.e. we need more wildlife and rewilded land, and we need to have less animals in order to do that. What I see logic in is the idea that we still need to grow vegetables and grains and soy and other crops. And so we need to wonder how to grow those crops in a way that is healthy to the soil. I mean, the FOA say that that we have, I think, something like 60 healthy harvests left in a lot of areas of the world because the land has been so depleted through pesticide use, fertilizer use, chemical use, basically, that we're degrading the soil itself, the soil health. And so I think there is an interesting question to be asked there around how do we grow the other food that we have to eat, and can we make sure that we're growing the other food we have to eat, which I think is important to add into this conversation, which I'm sure Pat will agree with, is the public health aspect, which I feel has been largely overlooked a lot in the mainstream media that I've seen this year, which is actually questioning why COVID happened. And the UN put out a report about a month ago from the UN Environmental Department, asking, kind of exploring why do pandemics happen and how can we stop future ones, and arguing based on the science that pandemics are increasing, that emerging new infectious disease rates are increasing, and they're increasing largely because of animal agriculture. The number one reason they gave was increase in the human appetite for animal protein products globally, and the second reason was intensive animal agriculture, and I think the third reason was the wildlife trade. So it's not specific to China, even though obviously COVID is coming from China. There are many other examples that have come out from around the world in recent decades, and I think that's a really important part to think about with this, is that if we don't change the way we're our systems of producing our food, and particularly animals, we are ultimately destroying our own health, even if you put aside the animal rights arguments, which I don't put aside, but I can see why, some people may.
It's such a challenge too, because in the, to the average person, whether they're in Wuhan or, rural America or urban America, they just go to, especially if they're poor, they go to the market. They just want to get their cheapest thing that they can find. I do think of Impossible Foods. To me, I got very excited about this concept, including other ones like it, because there's so many aspects of the protein that we consume that don't have to come from an animal that's then has a bolt put through its head, and whether your argument is environmental or not. And I think you're both articulating something that's just a part of our world going forward, which I wrote about way back in 2011 on .earth, my blog at the Times. There is no single future for food and the planet as varied as ours, with humans at different stages of development economically and otherwise, with that there are paths to, for example, what's called peak farmland for sure. We're at peak farmland globally, in the sense that it's not necessary to take down new land to feed everyone. And the way to use that land, how much of it is industrial, quote unquote, or small scale, often depends on the nature of a particular landscape. If we're in the Hudson Valley, you can find both still. In parts of England and across America, you can see a landscape of different approaches. And it feels like there's no single end point here. And that's why I really like Lily's book, because you're describing, in your conversations and in your experiences, you're describing sort of a hybrid sense of how we move forward. You talk to Greta Thunberg, but you also talk to Pat Brown and Elon Musk, and also to Extinction Rebellion. And you're even in the way you shape the book, you're essentially implying that conversation and listening. There's a whole chapter on listening, right? That listening and not just always reacting right away is a key path forward too. Could you talk about that part of your learning journey, the actual process of it? Hopefully, Lily,
Still
can you
here?
hear me?
Lily, I
Going
think
quite
it's
shaky.
frozen.
Lily, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, right now, yes.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, for me, I think probably the one thing I feel clearest about is listening, is the fact that these topics are really complex, and that we're all in this together. And I think it's so easy right now for polarization to happen. I think social media is driving, and the media in a way. Are you losing me, or you've got me?
It's a little laggy. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Sorry. I'm sorry. There's not much I can do.
No, I know.
Let's see if the universe will let the best bits cut through and edit out the worst bits of what I say. So what I was trying to say is that regardless of race, gender, our economic class, our country, we're all in this together. We all need a healthy planet. We all fundamentally want the next generation to inherit a healthy planet. And it's a really complex existential problem that we're facing right now. And so I think the need for us to be open-minded and to build bridges and to listen to each other has never been more important. And so I guess what I'm trying to do in the book is resist polarization and resist kind of jumping to conclusions or being ideological, and trying to exercise listening. And at the very end of the book, I write about a man called John Francis, who really inspired me actually on this point. I don't know if you know his work. He does a beautiful TED talk you could look up, because I think it was 1971, there was a big oil spill in San Francisco Bay, and he saw it, and his reaction was very visceral. And he said, I don't want anything to do with oil in any of the choices I make in my life, and I'm not going to step on a train, on a plane, in a car again. And he started walking everywhere. And he said when he first started doing that, he thought that there was going to be, like legions of people following him, like a movement. And it turned out he was the only one. But he kept doing it, and he did it for another 21 years. He walked for 7 years across America to go to university. And he said after a year or something, everyone kept asking him why he was doing it, and then debating with him about it. It doesn't have an impact if you by yourself do it, blah, blah, blah. And he got so tired of debating it that he decided to just stop talking. And he really enjoyed not talking and taking a vow of silence. And he continued his vow of silence for 17 years of those 21 years. And so in the midst of this, he spent 7 years walking across America, not talking, I think playing the banjo and staying with different communities along the way. And as a consequence, just listening and listening, he says, to lots of different communities that probably his parents or the media would have warned him against, or, were just different maybe to his normal social circles. And his massive realization he made on that journey, and the thing he said when he spoke for the first time after 21 years, was that environmental issues, in his perspective, are not so much about making policies and writing laws. He was studying environmental science, I think, as a PhD, but rather actually the environment begins with us, because of course we are, we're animals on a planet. We are part of the environment. We are the environment. And so the way we treat each other as a species is the first way we interact with our environment. And if we can't learn to collaborate, to listen to each other, to communicate better, then there's no chance of us kind of fixing the environment out there. And so, yeah, I give that story in the end as a kind of, I think, really powerful example of listening as a tool for environmentalism, if that makes any sense. It made sense to me.
It makes enormous sense to me. When I was writing that blog at the New York Times for 9 years, it was 2,800 pieces, along with my journalism, my regular reporting. And I moderated 100,000 comments. And I realized slowly that when you're managing a conversation like that, you can choose different paths. All of us have a choice every moment in a conversation to be a listener, or to be jumping into the fray, to be waiting for your rebuttal, or to really be listening in a deep way. And that feels like a pretty valuable lesson. And you're right, that's interesting. This gets back to the social environment the communication environment we're all living in right now, which seems so hijacked. And I wanted, you both count yourself, I think, as optimists. It's pretty clear, not just in your rhetoric, but in your activity. But what a year we're in the middle of, huh? Just step back and pause. And I was telling Pat, I was in the Bay Area in February, meeting with one of his partners, and just by chance, and it feels like it was February of some other year, some other lifetime. And maybe it's worth pausing just right now to just reflect on the broad sustainability questions right in the juncture we're in right now. So, Pat, for you, it's a company, it's a product. It's increasingly in restaurants I go to here or in the market. And yet it's a very big hill to climb to think about China's impact, China's markets and the like. And so has this year been a reset kind of a year for you and your ambitions? And then Lily will talk more again about your sense of where you're at in the context of this year. You mentioned it in the book. I think right as you were closing out the book, COVID-19 was breaking. So, but Pat, first, is there something big about this year that shapes the way you'll be thinking going forward?
I would say, I certainly wouldn't say it's a reset. Obviously, I think that given what our intention is, which is to completely replace the use of animals as a food technology by 2035, every year is going to be a challenge. And over the next, 15 years, COVID is one of many, unplanned for challenges and disruptions, but it hasn't fundamentally changed our course, whatsoever. And, we shifted our commercial focus more toward retail, since a lot of restaurants basically kind of went into hibernation. But apart from that, no, not in any fundamental way. We're just as, we're growing and just as determined as ever. This is, the COVID thing is a disaster, but it's minuscule compared to the disaster that we are just racing toward if we don't solve this biodiversity collapse and climate change problems. So our focus is just as strong as ever on our goal.
And that the way you describe your
question.
Oh, sorry. Go for it.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I read that fake meat products like were doing really well in COVID, that they like were soaring. Was that your experience in terms of sales?
Well, I don't think of our product as fake meat. I think of it as just meat made a better way. But
sorry.
No, that's okay. But I
you know
always
what I
have
mean.
to
Sorry,
interject that because fake meat sounds pejorative. But yeah, it's interesting. I think that there's a couple of reasons why it's at least in the U.S. There's been like a 200% increase in overall demand for plant-based products. I think it's a couple of things. Number one, the incumbent meat industry has done a pretty good job of getting people to not think about where their meat comes from. And, the word slaughterhouse is rarely spoken when people are talking about meat. And because the COVID epidemic disproportionately was because of those, it's such a terrible working environment for the workers in those slaughterhouses. They became hotspots for COVID, and there was a lot of public attention on, slaughterhouses. Oh, I forgot they even existed. I thought that meat just magically appeared on our shelves. So I think that was one thing. It just was a little bit eye-opening to people, reminding them, what the system is. And then the other thing is that the meat supply chain, because those slaughterhouses are so ridiculous, it's very vulnerable. Actually, this is why I'm so confident we're going to crash it, is that actually it's much more fragile than people think. And when grocery stores ran out of meat from animals, people would, for the first time, stop just, robotically going to the meat counter and grabbing the same thing they bought every week and looking at other things. So I think those are two factors that will have a lasting impact. But still 95% of everybody in the US is a regular meat consumer. So there's, animal meat consumers. There's a long way to go.
There's a comment that makes a point that Lily makes for sure, which is, so the best way to transition is consumer pull. I think one thing that you both have described is the pathways to transition are more through opportunity than through pummeling with scary messaging. It feels, I may be wrong, but I see Pat nodding. And Lily, a lot of what you've written is also about that sense of possibility. And not, I mean, it's not you talk about Greta Thunberg as a, who's much more into the warning messaging, and you're not disparaging what she does at all, but you're also pointing to this other possibility too.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I feel like consumer pull is really, really, really critical. I think we can't, this like rhetoric sometimes of it being like us and them with the government, we expect the government to make changes, but then all the market signals the other way is really unfair. That actually you need, in a democracy, you need to show there's a kind of public will for something in order to expect politicians to react and make changes. That being said, and consumer pull is part of that signaling. That being said, I think right now it's really unfair to put all the onus on consumers, because I think it's really hard to be a conscious consumer and to navigate the complexity of these choices. It's often not, I think, an Impossible Foods example, and I think that's why what you're doing is really important, but often sustainable options are more expensive and they're harder to find. The information around it can be quite confusing. And so I think from that perspective, we really, really need political policy to lead the way and to make sure that carbon pricing happens, for example, so that the real costs of good are shown to the consumers. And if something is polluting the environment, it costs more to make because it's priced differently. I think there are political levers that are essential, but I see them as a connected dance between citizens and politicians. I don't see them as separate.
I want to ask you a couple more things before we end. And I'm sorry about the internet connection issues, but I think people are getting the brunt of what you're saying. We might try to have you on again sometime. It'd be great. I hope that would be fun, because there's a lot to explore here, both of you.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we got to get the Azores to do a better job with their internet.
Yeah. Lily, you've interviewed, you've met some remarkable people, among them Stephen Hawking, as you describe here. I'm showing people toward the end of the book, the reflective ending, you quote Stephen Hawking saying, "I've noticed that even people who claim that everything is predestined and that we can do nothing to change it, look before they cross the road." In other words, there's a sense of possibility again. The world feels so wrapped in a pandemic and still more than 80% dependent on fossil fuels. And as Pat delineated, reliant on these mass chains of mass manufactured animals, essentially. There are individual beings to create our protein. And it feels sometimes paralytic and dispiriting. So in all the interviews you've done and in all the experiences you've had, can you articulate your definition of optimism?
For me, optimism is like a choice that I try to make, and I don't make it every day. I try to make it every day, but there are some days I wake up and I feel really mad at the world, and I can see that things are really scary and that we're in a really scary situation, and I don't feel optimistic. But I think that I then try and choose to be optimistic. I recognize that there is still time and that we still have the power and the capacity to change the direction that we're going in. And actually, as the book is a testament to, there are lots of signals that many people and many companies and many organizations and many politicians are trying to change that trajectory in a positive direction. And so that gives me hope that we can turn things around.
And Pat, you have this capacity that you've demonstrated to direct your intellectual powers and your networks and your partnerships toward some pretty powerful questions. Is there some general advice you could provide to others who, people in academia? I'm surrounded by people who want to be more impactful, but who are stuck in tenure track fights and the like. Just today, ended a 24-hour session with the National Science Foundation about a big grant to clarify climate risks and the like. And so is there a certain kind of person or capacity it takes to jump the tracks and pursue more directly a challenge like this? Or is there a general capacity that we're just underappreciating?
Well, I think that a big part of the problem, actually, the biggest part of the problem is people kind of sort of count themselves out. Okay, first of all, one thing in academia that happens all the time is people put a label on themselves, and it's like, oh, I'm a geneticist, and so I do genetics, and therefore you've kind of like put yourself in a box. And why? You're just as capable of, I never did that. I always felt like you can call me whatever you want. I'm not labeling myself as I'm just a biochemist or just whatever. I'm whatever I need to be to make an impact. And I think that people, it's a shame that people, like with climate, there's this notion that, oh, it's not my job. I'm just one person. Maybe the best I think can do is, just stop using plastic bags or something like that. Meanwhile, it's up to the UN or the government or something like that to solve this problem. Well, don't kid yourself. Do you see any sign that that's going to happen? I think that so many of these things, it's so difficult to get the kind of political consensus and will and so forth. And the people that, if you think that someone else is responsible for this, it's just a complete illusion. And therefore that means you should take responsibility. And I feel like so many people who are capable of having a big impact, not just, trying not to contribute to the problem, they could actually step up and try to do something about it. But they think, no, I'm just, I'm a geneticist, I'm a reporter, I'm whatever. And it's someone else's job to solve this. So I think that's such an unfortunate thing. I'm always trying to tell, when I talk to young people and students and so forth, don't label yourself in such a limiting way. These big problems, you own them as much as anyone does. And if you step up, that's the biggest thing that the biggest thing, it's not your intellectual capacity, it's your initiative and deciding that I will take responsibility to solve this problem. I mean, I think Greta Thunberg is a good example. Here's some, obviously special but sort of random kid. What defined her as an impactful person? She just decided to do something about it. Okay, that's all. And I think not enough people do that. And so many more people are capable of having a much bigger impact if they just climb out of their little narrow box and decide to.
There's a quote I give at the end of the book from Robert Swan, which I really like, which says, "The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it."
Oh, I love that.
Noticing that one.
Yeah. I love that. It is absolutely the greatest threat to our planet. Yeah.
And I want to show the absolute coda of the book, which is, again, with Stephen Hawking, where here's the book cover again. It's a worthy read, I would say. It's a beautifully articulated vision of a way to shape a life around these tough questions. In the epilogue, you asked Stephen Hawking, do you believe anything is possible? And the way you set it up was, well, maybe you could just say, could you read this? I don't know if you could see it on
with
your screen.
my patchy internet, I can try.
Oh, no, I'll say, but you could try it.
I was asking, do you believe anything is possible? I was asking the scientists who had studied the universe from molecules to black holes, who considered science as God and advocated space travel, if he believed that anything is possible. I was asking the man who lived 27 times longer than doctors predicted if he believed anything is possible. Stephen gave a half smile, and his son Tim gently laughed. That's a yes. It was a really special moment. For obvious reasons. It was,
and it resonates that way on the page. That's just a beautiful way to close what I hope is just an initial conversation on pathways on this planet that can be creditable journeys toward better outcomes, knowing the complexity and scale of what we face. A beautifully shaped conversation here, obviously imperfect as the internet always is. And but I just want to thank both of my guests today. Pat Brown, CEO of Impossible Foods, member of the National Academy of Sciences, a great innovator in science and in technology and open access literature. And Lily Cole, who has a multifaceted career, and I think her career as a writer for sure, going forward. This is a wonderful new book. I just wanted to show something to close things out. And of course, I just lost it. I thought I had it set up. Great to have you both here. Thank you, guys. Hold on a second.
Yeah.
And again, we should, I'd like to think of this as a journey. What I'm doing, this program is a series of conversations. There have been about 90, and most of them have a part 2. So let's see what we can do. And
happy to do part 2 with better internet.
Yeah, and that would be great.
It's like a UFO landing in your backyard.
On Friday, the next show on Friday is about journalism's role in confronting the climate challenge. Yeah, I've been writing about global warming, sad to say, since 1988 myself. 30-something years ago, my first cover story, I'll just show you in Discover magazine. That's a long time ago, and it's so long ago there were cigarette ads on the back of the Science magazine. It says a lot. So what are the journeys going forward for journalism? We'll be describing that on Friday. Sunday is my regular session of songs and poetry, and then on into the next round. We're in the middle of Climate Week here. Thank you again, Pat Brown of Impossible Foods and Lily Cole with your book for being part of this conversation.
Thanks, Andy.
Good. Thanks so much.
Stay well.
Yeah, you too.